Hello, I am Dr. Lawrence Smith, Dean of the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. Thank you for tuning in to Well Said. In a culture of community, scholarship, and innovation, the Zucker School of Medicine is dedicated to transforming students into doctors who will improve healthcare, inspire change, and better the lives of the people they serve. It is why we are pleased to collaborate with WRHU Radio Hofstra University to bring you a program committed to sharing expert discussion and insight on health and wellness topics important to you. Join us today and each week for a recommended dose of Well Said with your host, Dr. Ira Nash.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ira Nash. Welcome to Well Said. Today we'll be discussing wilderness medicine. In our last episode, we spoke to a dermatologist about sun safety, but today's episode will focus on a broader range of medical challenges of the great outdoors. My guest is my colleague, Dr. Sanjey Gupta. Dr. Gupta is the Chair of Emergency Medicine at South Shore University Hospital and a Professor of Emergency Medicine at the Zucker School of Medicine, and I'm delighted that he's joined us today. Sanjey, welcome to Well Said.
Oh, Ira, thanks so much, and thank you for having me today.
So before we get into the whole wilderness medicine thing, I can't miss the opportunity to ask you as an emergency medicine physician how you and your team have been coping with the circumstances of the pandemic.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly been tough for us, an unprecedented kind of experience. But I think, as a team, we've been very good about supporting each other so that we can provide, the best care for the patients when they come in. So, we've been obviously gone through wave 1, wave 2 already, and we were already in preparation for what could be, a potential spike up in wave 3. We've seen a few cases rise, of COVID, a few more admissions, but nothing that we are alarmed about yet, and we're certainly prepared for whatever comes.
Yeah, well, thank you for your efforts, and hang in there.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's get started, and maybe you can get the conversation going by just defining what wilderness medicine is.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I get asked that a lot. And even the term wilderness medicine, I think, conjures a certain image in people's minds. But I think the best way that I think about this, and this was a definition that was actually coined by one of my colleagues at Mass General named Stuart Harris, is the provision of resource-limited medicine in austere conditions. So, wilderness medicine does have its origin in just that, in kind of mountain outdoor medicine. But now we think about wilderness medicine being the ability to provide healthcare in any environment that is resource limited. So that might be in a remote environment, it might be in a wilderness environment, but it also might be in a post-disaster scenario environment. So an example of this, may have been in Louisiana after hurricanes that they've had in the past, or even, maybe the South Shore of Long Island after Hurricane Sandy, where much of our infrastructure was disrupted. So any place where we have to practice medicine with limited resources, where the environment might be less than ideal, is kind of how I think about what wilderness medicine is. Some people have even thought about using the term resource-limited medicine rather than wilderness medicine to kind of provide that, different context.
Yeah, I mean, I must say, when you say wilderness medicine, I conjure up images of like bears and snakes, but that's an interesting distinction to talk about it in terms of trying to provide healthcare in an environment where you don't have the usual support mechanisms or infrastructure to do it.
Yeah, and that's right, and that's the way that many of us who kind of are experts in wilderness medicine think about that sort of practice, because it also then allows us to use those skills in different environments. So many people who practice wilderness medicine, may do search and rescue. They might do ski patrol. Some people do travel and do humanitarian response. Many people are tactical or military. So, it kind of has a broad range of approach for people's, different interests and different levels of participation in medical activities.
And so how does the training for somebody interested in this field differ from the training that a typical emergency medicine physician would have?
Wilderness medicine fits very well with our emergency medicine mindset. I mean, emergency medicine training is obviously done in a hospital, and we have access to technology and CTs and MRIs and consultants and many of these things. So much of our practice is based around the concept of we'll take care of anyone with anything that we have on hand at any time. We're here for the community, for their needs. We're here to take care of people as they come. So, wilderness medicine is kind of a natural extension of that, in that no matter what environment we are in, no matter what resources we have, we'll figure out a way to provide care. And so one of the basis of wilderness medicine is actually the concept of improvisation. Like, how do you improvise care with what you have on hand? We don't have to do that to a huge extent in emergency medicine, but it is always the idea of being creative, being innovative, and maybe thinking outside of the box of your usual mechanisms and tools and what else you can do with those.
The closest I think I've ever been to a situation where I felt very alone was on an airplane, where one of the flight attendants says, "Hey, is there a doctor on board?" Is that something that would fit into this sort of rubric of doing a little MacGyver action to deal with the situation at hand?
Yeah, absolutely. I think an airplane is a great example. I mean, that's a kind of a modern convenience. I mean, you have computers and all sorts of other equipment in there, but the medical kit that's standardized in most airplanes in North America and the United States, it's a very limited pack, and it really hasn't been updated since the 1990s. So it doesn't have tools and provisions even for pediatric cases in there. So when you have this, they might need a physician, and you go and they hand you this kit with that still has cardiac lidocaine in it, or other mixtures of medications that without a thermometer, which is not in there, or a pulse ox. You have to be innovative and creative in how you can care for patients with those tools. So absolutely, I think that is a great example.
Yeah, and just to clarify for our listeners who might not get the lidocaine reference, that's a medication that used to be commonly used when people are having a heart attack, but hasn't been part of the standard treatment protocol for like 20 years. So let's get back to the great outdoors in our conversation. One of the things that people think about, especially in the middle of the summer, is overheating and heat stroke or heat exhaustion. Could you distinguish the sort of degrees of heat injury and what people should be doing about them?
We hear a lot of these terms thrown around, like, kind of heat passing out, or I have heat cramps, or, I have heat exhaustion. And, the best way to think about this is almost a little bit of a spectrum of, if you're outdoors, and especially if you're outdoors doing some activities, the way you kind of gain heat and you get hot is one by your kind of own body metabolism. And, obviously if you're doing some activities, doing some work outside or at a barbecue, or maybe, walking on the boardwalk, taking a jog, you're increasing your body heat. But then you also gain heat from the environment. So, that might be the sun blaring down on you, and sometimes, you don't think about these things if you're walking. For instance, I was just in Hawaii, and there was a black sand beach that I had visited. But that black sand is much hotter than kind of typical white sand, and that's more heat that's actually kind of coming up on you, and you can absorb some of that heat. So, this is kind of how you gain heat, and this can lead to a heat illness. So, some people might experience, things like heat cramps, or even heat edema, which is a term for like heat swelling. Heat cramp might be, you're outside, you're doing some activities, you're sweating, but you're not quite taking in enough fluid, or if you're taking in fluid, you're just taking in water without any other electrolytes, something that you might get from a Gatorade or another sports drink like salt or potassium. Then you can get cramps in your muscles from there. So that's pretty common. And a way to kind of mitigate that is to make sure that if you're kind of replacing, the fluid from your sweat, you're doing that with some sort of drink that has some electrolytes in it. some people find that they travel on vacation to a hot environment, and then suddenly their feet are kind of swollen, their hands are swollen, and this is nothing to be concerned about. This just happens, as you're in a hot environment, your blood vessels kind of dilate, which is the medical term for kind of open up, and it helps you kind of maintain dump your heat to the environment. But that can also cause some swelling in your soft tissues. And, usually that just resolves by traveling to a cooler temperature, or just after time, your body gets used to it. Some people, I used to work in Flushing, Queens, so we'd actually get a lot of people coming in from Citi Field passing out. They'd be out watching a baseball game, and they'd be in their seat, and they would stand up, and they would actually pass out. And sometimes that's just due to, being out in a hot environment, and your body trying to cool will make its blood vessels kind of, grow larger, or you try to dump some heat out into the environment. You have some sweating going on, so you may be a little bit dehydrated. So when you stand up, your blood doesn't quite get to your heart fast enough. It's something called functional orthostasis is kind of the medical term. And that's usually not too, serious either. Sometimes people can go into a cooler environment, have something to drink, and they should be okay. Where we start getting into real kind of more serious heat illness problems is we start getting into the spectrum of like heat exhaustion or heat stroke. And these are the types of situations that can definitely be more serious. So like heat exhaustion is, again, being in a hot environment, and sweating and, losing some of your electrolytes, but, kind of gaining heat. Patients can have, kind of symptoms like a headache, might feel weak or dizzy, might actually even lose some coordination, so you feel a little clumsy. You're sweating, but it's not enough to kind of cool you down. And your blood pressure might actually go down a little bit. Your heart rate might go up. Usually with this, you're still thinking pretty normally, and you're sweating. You're just gaining heat, so you're kind of outstripping your ability to cool, which mainly comes from sweating in these environments. But it can also come from other behavioral controls, like, if you're outside, you should be wearing a light, loose shirt rather than, like a jacket, and you have to make sure you stay hydrated. And usually people's body temperatures might be elevated above your normal, but generally below 104. Heat stroke is where we really start worrying about people, and heat stroke is potentially deadly. This is, unfortunately, we hear these stories every summer with athletes who might be going back for football training or training in other sports. Right. Yeah, and that's like the number one cause of death for athletes in the summer is actually heat stroke. And so that's why a lot of teams are very cognizant. But this is where, there's two types of heat stroke. One is called exertional heat stroke. That's like exercise-induced heat stroke. And that comes on very rapidly. Body temperatures, get to be above 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah, and then you might have some kind of central nervous system problems. So you might have confusion, might even have a seizure, loss of consciousness, altered mental status. And this is usually due to exposure to the heat, and then maybe some heat gain internally, like if you're working out, exercising, and you're not really used to the heat. And, with that, that causes a lot of problems down the road. It actually causes a lot of damage to your blood vessels. You get severe inflammation, and can lead to a multi-organ system failure where, your kidneys and your heart or other organs, your brain are, directly affected. You can even have some like death in muscles.
So what would that look like to a bystander?
So a bystander would be someone, if a bystander is walking by and they find someone who feels hot, for one, looks like they've been out of heat, who is, maybe having a seizure or has a decreased mental status, is confused. And, a lot of times these patients can be sweating. Sometimes they're not sweating, though. That's going to be what the appearance is. And the most important thing for that situation is to actually call 911 if you can, because rapid cooling of the patient is going to be the most important thing that you can do. And if you're in a situation where you can start some cooling before 911, before the ambulance arrives, you should start that. And some of the simple things to do is like pulling a person into the shade.
Yeah.
If you have like a spritz bottle and a fan, or if you have an ability to fan, just start doing that, because evaporation is a really strong mechanism to get people cooling. If you have some ice around, I don't know if you're in a park, get some ice on the patient, usually on the face, neck, under the underarms. Just starting things like that can actually be a big help. One thing that we should always keep in mind, though, is we don't want to gain heat. So if we lay somebody down somewhere, we want to make sure that that's not a hot space where they might actually gain heat from the environment. There's another type of heat stroke that we see, and that's what they call classic heat stroke. And we often see that with, elderly or patients who are in long-term care facilities, where that heat gain or that heat stroke is not as sudden, but it's heat gained over time. And we see that in a lot of heat waves. And these might be patients who are older, socially isolated, sedentary. A lot of it happens just due to environmental conditions, or in a hot living environment. They don't have air conditioning, so they kind of gain that heat over what might be several days, rather than like very suddenly due to an activity.
And is that the same mechanism that could threaten, say, a small child who's stuck in a car, where you hear these tragic stories from time to time where somebody leaves a kid in the car and in hot weather, and
Yeah, absolutely. Younger people, so elderly and actually the youth, are much more susceptible to heat illness and to heat stroke. They sweat at a higher temperature. A decreased capacity to cool. But yeah, and those cars get hot very, very quickly, and it doesn't take too long to overcome your ability to sweat and kind of cool yourself down.
Yeah. So speaking of cooling down, obviously a lot of people use swimming pools or other bodies of water to cool off or keep cool in the summertime. Let's talk a little bit about drowning, which is obviously the major downside to using water. What is drowning, and how should you respond to somebody who may be in extremis in the water?
Drowning, we get a lot of, we see and hear a lot of news stories, and the different terms are thrown around, like drowning, dry drowning, wet drowning, near drowning. So actually, in the medical world, there really is only drowning. Not to,
Let's not make this more complicated than it really is, right?
Yeah, there's drowning with what we call no morbidity, drowning with morbidity, meaning there might be some long-term consequence, or there's drowning with mortality, meaning that someone drowns, unfortunately passes away. But, drowning really occurs with kind of aspiration of water. So, there's some oxygen deprivation due to your body due to either immersion or submersion in water. So submersion might be like...
Sanjey, just to back you up a little bit. So aspiration meaning you have water coming into your lungs instead of air coming into your lungs.
Right. Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't want to use medical terms, meaning that, you do have some water coming into your kind of airway, into your lungs, and a submersion might mean that you dip down under the water surface like you're in a pool, or an immersion might be like someone splashes water on your face and just happens to hit you while you're inhaling. And what can happen is that water actually hits your vocal cords, and it kind of irritates your vocal cords, and that your vocal cords actually spasm. And that's actually the initial step to drowning. So sometimes when we hear about the old terms like dry drowning, they find no fluid in the lungs, but it could be just due to that mechanism. So as your vocal cords spasm, you can't breathe. The air can't pass from your mouth into your lungs. And then what happens then is that your body very rapidly becomes what's called acidotic, meaning that you kind of gain your acid basically in your blood, and your blood isn't normally acidotic, and that can cause one to lose consciousness. So then what happens sometimes with that in the water, let's say you're in the water, you get your vocal cords kind of spasm up, meaning they close up, you can't breathe, you lose consciousness because of that, and when you lose consciousness, your vocal cords have a tendency to loosen, and that's when you actually get water into your lungs. So it's kind of weird to think about. So, with a lot of these terms that we used to use, like near drowning, dry drowning, or wet drowning, it can kind of be explained by understanding what actually occurs in drowning.
Yeah, and again, for the bystanders, somebody gets pulled out of the water, they're unconscious. What should people do other than call 911 and get somebody who knows what they're doing on the scene? But
yeah, absolutely. So this is where things are different. So I think a lot of people have taken CPR training, and a lot of our CPR training recently has revolved around doing like rapid and regular chest compressions, of the chest before even providing breaths. So it used to be,
right.
You give breaths and you do compressions and breaths. So this is actually one area where that situation should be reversed, because most of drowning, where people's hearts stop beating and they're not breathing, is the mechanism is actually just from this. It's actually respiratory, meaning it's from the lungs and the fact that they couldn't breathe due to this spasm or injury to the lungs. So this is actually where a bystander may want to start with rescue breaths first. So you actually go back to providing the breaths, then doing chest compressions. You might do like a ratio of like 2 breaths, 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 30 compressions. So you may actually go back to that model of breathing. It's important. And if there's a bystander who actually is trained, because there happen to be people who are, trained lifeguards or trained in some other rescue, this is someone who is actually found in the water. If you have the ability to kind of start this in the water, the sooner the better. Drowning does differ from most other types of bystander CPR in that you want to start the respirations, the breathing first before you actually start the chest compression.
That's really good advice. We've talked about heat injuries, we've talked about water injuries. What other things are commonly encountered for this sort of, I'll say, weekend warrior kind of somebody going out for a hike, may not be in the greatest shape, but they get into trouble because why? What happens?
Most of the time, I think people, when they run into trouble, they kind of go out with the presumption that they're not going to run into trouble, or say, it's a quick thing, let me just go out. So the idea is that, if you're going to go out for a hike, and I do this, I've done a fair amount of hiking and backpacking over the years, is that, you always have to presume a little bit that something unexpected might happen. So that one unexpected thing that you don't realize is that, you might think that you're just going for a hike, and if you run into a problem, you can make a call on your cell phone, unless you're in a place that has no signal. Another thing might be, I'm just going to go for a quick hike. It's fine until you start hiking and you realize the terrain is actually much rockier or muddier, and you have a simple orthopedic injury. But a simple sprained ankle might be able to, you may not be able to leave the environment that you're in because of that. So my advice is always, and there's a lot of resources online, is to always have a little pack of items with you that help you survive what we call an unintentional night out. So, think about being in a place where, you do get stuck, you can't get out, or you get injured. Like, what can you do for a night until someone can come rescue you, or a few hours? And so, things in this sort of pack it's nothing really extraordinary, but it might be, some pain relievers, maybe, medically like an ACE wrap in case you get an injury. Personally, I always carry, this is going to sound very funny, but I always carry a large contractor bag with me, because a contractor bag can be your best friend in a tough environment. So that's a
Really?
big plastic thick bag. Yeah. So it can provide you a shelter if it's raining. If you put on a plastic bag, you don't really lose heat from evaporation. So it can help you maintain your body heat. So you have like an instant shelter right there. You have an instant raincoat in case it starts raining. You just pop your head through and your arms through. And so that's something that could be, very useful. Some people promote an ability for you to light a fire, even if it's, raining. So some people bring a lighter. Some people will talk about a metal match, like a flint and steel, which can be hard to use if you haven't trained with that before. some sort of fire starter, so whether that's like steel wool. Personally, I bring cotton balls that are kind of infused with petroleum jelly. Sounds funny, but that's like a very instant, very easy to make survival candle and build, fire starter. So if you haven't tried it, go home and get some cotton balls, get some petroleum jelly, and you'll be surprised what sort of kind of survival candle you can make with that. So,
wow. You're making me feel very irresponsible for all the times I've gone on, just a sort of day hike with just some water and a map.
Yeah. Again, 99.9% of the time, that's going to be absolutely fine. But just in those situations where you may not be in an environment that you're completely comfortable with or about, having some of these simple things can help you. Duct tape is always everyone's best friend. You can always fix everything with duct tape. So I always have some duct tape. I actually have duct tape wrapped around my water bottle. So I always have like a spool of duct tape in case I ever need it for anything.
I have to ask you this question. Do your kids make brutal fun of you for having all this stuff with you just in case?
Yeah, there's always, they're going to make fun of you anyway, but it's kind of like, why do you need all that? I'm like, just trust me, don't worry. But it's funny, I'll tell you a story. Recently, I was just camping a few weeks ago, and I wasn't as fully prepared as normal. So as we were starting the fire at the campground, it rained for about 15 minutes, then all the wood was wet. So trying to get it back lit up I didn't bring any cotton balls with petroleum jelly, which would have started this really easily, but I found in my little first aid kit that I had some Bassett Trace ointment, which is already, that's in petroleum
That's mostly
jelly.
Petroleum jelly, right?
Yeah, and then I had cotton gauzes, so I just made it real quick, and then that started working, and then I had half a bag of potato chips, and I threw that in there, and that lit the whole thing up, because potato chips are, kind of carbohydrates soaked in oil. It's a great, like, fire accelerator.
I never thought of potato chips as kindling, but that's a good thing to know.
Yeah, kind of the idea of improvisation, using, things for, how do we put this, non-label use. So I don't think, Kettle brand potato chips ever thought they were going to be used to start a fire in the woods, but
Yeah,
it seemed to
well,
work.
that's really interesting. I know you can also light an alcohol swab if you need to as a fire starter, but it doesn't burn as long as, I guess, a cotton ball's soaked in petroleum jelly.
Right. No, that's another use. Yeah, there's always these kind of like little survival stories. There's always cute things that may or may not be valid, but one of them was always if you're on a beach, you can make a little pyramid of sand and soak it with like a bottle of bourbon or vodka or something and try to light that up as a fuel candle. I've never tried that, but I don't know how effective or useful that'll be.
Yeah, it does seem like a good use of a bottle of vodka, I must say.
Yeah.
For our listeners who are interested in learning more about either how to protect themselves outdoors or in, as you say, austere environments, or just about the field itself, can you direct them to any sources of reliable information?
There's certainly a lot of, kind of websites out there. There's certainly a lot of articles. I mean, if you go into some backpacking magazine or some outdoor magazine, they usually have some series of, wilderness medicine articles or, kind of survival articles, even your local outdoor store. So, like, I have no conflict, but like REI sometimes has these community level talks or discussions on wilderness medicine. But there's a lot of actually training programs out there that lay people can take if they're really, really interested to become a wilderness first aid certified, or for people who might already be in the medical field a little bit, like a paramedic or something else, wilderness first aid, and there's like wilderness advanced life support. So there's this whole spectrum depending on what your background is and needs, but there's a lot of education courses. So, just searching online is a simple way to do it, finding articles in outdoor related magazines, kind of your community kind of groups. There's a lot of different training that you could do out there.
Sanjey, thank you so much for explaining all this and for joining me today.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you for having me.
My guest has been Dr. Sanjey Gupta, the Chair of Emergency Medicine at Hofstra University Hospital and Professor of Emergency Medicine at the Zucker School of Medicine. For more information about this program and to find past episodes, please visit sites.hofstra.edu/wellsaid. You can also subscribe to our free podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Our listeners are welcome to send comments, suggestions, and questions to wellsaid@hofstra.edu. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ira Nash, and that's well said.